Michael Wayne Ryan was an American murderer, white supremacist, antisemite and cult leader who during the 1980s led a group of Christian extremists who were based on a farm just outside the tiny village of Rulo in Nebraska, where they gathered weapons for an impending race war that Ryan had been told, apparently by God, would soon herald the end of the world. Within their compound, Ryan referred to himself as a king and the embodiment of the archangel Michael. However, the reality was that Michael Ryan was a psychopathic sexual sadist who used his position to direct horrific acts of violence and sexual abuse, including fathers being forced to engage in sex acts with their young sons and vice versa. This horrific environment eventually led to the murder of two people, a little boy called Luke Stice, who was only 5 years old, and a 26-year-old man called James Thimm. The death of James was particularly horrific, with him being tortured over the space of 3 days, including being sexually abused by having objects, including the handle of a shovel, rammed into his anus, and having his skin cut with a razor and pulled off with pliers, before being brutally murdered. This case is one of the worst I've ever come across, and will make you question how deep and dark the depths of depravity people are capable of really go. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Nebraska is a state in the American Midwest, part of the Corn Belt, which also includes Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas and Missouri. These are all states that are dominated by farming and agriculture. Nebraska is a place with areas of amazing natural beauty. It's also a state which is sparsely populated, with many villages and towns having fewer than 3,000 people. It's an area where people can settle and enjoy a quiet rural life, but it's also a state where dangerous people can operate undetected. One of these people was Michael Wayne Ryan, who was born on August 3rd, 1948, in Kansas. His place of birth was likely the city of Antony, a city approximately 55 miles southwest of Wichita, as this is where he grew up and went to school. He was the eldest of 5 children to a woman called Elsie and a man named Gene, but the household was abusive, with the pair frequently arguing and Gene beating his wife, all while the children watched. Ryan didn't do very well in school, but I've read differing accounts as to why. Some sources say this was due to his low intelligence, but others state he was actually of average or even above average intelligence, but just couldn't be bothered to apply himself. Regardless, he didn't graduate from high school. However, Ryan did not seem bothered by this. He'd already decided on a career path for himself. For years he'd had dreams of being in the military, but not just a regular soldier serving his country. No, he wanted to be a decorated officer, and when he was around 17 or 18 years old, he applied to join the US Army. He got as far as the Army physical, but was rejected on medical grounds. It appears this was due to Ryan having an undescended testicle, which meant that it hadn't dropped down from his abdomen into the scrotal sac during his childhood. Rejection from the army was a major turning point for Ryan. He became extremely angry. This was, in large part, due to his childhood dreams being crushed, but, as we'll get into later, he was a man who didn't take rejection well. No was not a word he understood. Around this time, Michael Ryan met a girl called Ruth, who was still in high school. Towards Ruth, Ryan would show his ability to manipulate and charm people. She was underage and her parents didn't approve of the relationship and tried to forbid the pair from seeing each other, but Ryan would repeatedly tell Ruth how special she was, how much he loved her, and how he couldn't imagine his life without her, driving a wedge between her and her parents, to the point where, when she was just 16 years old, she ran away with Ryan and was missing for 6 months before being located by the police and returned home. From what I've read, Ruth had moved to the city of Antony not long before her relationship began with Ryan, and, being new to the area, she didn't have many friends and became reliant on Ryan for companionship. Whether he targeted her because he felt she was lonely is unclear, but likely he was a predator who could sense vulnerability. When Ruth was just 17 years old, the pair got married, and she remained with Ryan until his eventual arrest in 1985, so the relationship lasted over 20 years. I use the term relationship loosely, as this implies an equal partnership between two people, and this was anything but. Behind closed doors, Michael Ryan was a monster. He would frequently beat Ruth, including strangling her, until she passed out, with him expecting her to comply with all of his demands, without question, but this included satisfying his sexual appetites. Ruth was raped repeatedly over the years of the marriage, and there was no ambiguity in terms of her lack of consent, as she would often cry and scream whilst Ryan forced himself on her. He knew she didn't consent, he simply did not care. Given what happened next, he also likely got off on the pain and terror he caused his wife during these acts of sickening sexual violence. The marriage produced 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The youngest child was named Mary, the middle child was called Alvin, and the eldest child was called Dennis. Dennis is a key figure in the later crimes committed by his father, so will be the only one of the 3 children that I will focus on. All of them, though, would frequently witness their father beating their mother, but it appears that Dennis, out of the 3 children, would soon join his mother as a target of his father's violent abuse. Any infraction of any rule would result in a beating. Dennis idolised his father, and just wanted his love and attention, and believed as the years progressed, he was at fault. He deserved the beatings, and he looked for any way to please his father, which would lead to his involvement in horrific crimes when he was still a child himself. Like most domestic abusers, Michael Ryan was a hypocritical tyrant. He expected his rules to be followed, but believed he should be allowed to do anything he wanted. He was frequently unfaithful, and would make no efforts to hide his behaviour. He would try to get Ruth to arrange sexual encounters with her few female friends, and would often make crass comments about wishing to sleep with them around the dinner table. On some occasions, Ruth would actually find women's underwear and clothing in the home, evidence of the affairs, and, when she confronted her husband, he would just shrug his shoulders, or, more often than not, beat her for daring to question him. However, with regards to Ruth, he made it clear that if she cheated on him, or left him, he would hunt her down and kill her. Ryan repeatedly accused her of affairs she wasn't having, whilst he was constantly sleeping with other women throughout their marriage. Over the years, Ruth was ground down, and she simply accepted her situation, being too exhausted and afraid to be able to do anything about it, so she suffered beatings and rapes for years. This is why, in around 1979 or 1980, when Ryan suggested that Ruth ask a friend of hers, called Janet, to have a threesome with them, she complied. Janet also said yes, but this was not a one-off event. The 3 of them lived together, with Ryan essentially being in a relationship with 2 women at the same time. Again, there are indicators of Ryan's predatory behaviour, his ability to sense weakness and exploit it. Janet was a woman struggling to raise 3 children in the aftermath of a difficult and drawn-out divorce. He knew she was vulnerable. Eventually, Ruth, Ryan, and their 3 children moved in with Janet and her 3 children, and Janet would soon regret agreeing to be any part of the relationship between Ruth and Ryan. As with Ruth, Ryan began looking to control Janet and expected his rules to be followed. On one occasion, he demanded that Janet spend the day in bed with him. When she refused, he beat her mercilessly, including strangling her. Due to this, it appears that Janet was able to get the family to leave, but they only moved a short distance away and rented a home down the street, and the families continued to hang out as the children were friends. On one occasion, Janet and the children were invited over for dinner, and, without warning, as she went to leave, Ryan ran full pelt at her, and in front of both his and her children, grabbed Janet and dragged her into a room, and then began punching her repeatedly in the face. He then stopped, went to get a towel to give to Janet to clear up the blood, left, but then returned again, and began to viciously attack Janet for a second time, for absolutely no reason. This time, he began to strangle her. The police were called, but it appears nothing came of this. Why is unclear. Janet severed ties with the family. After this, the family moved to a dilapidated farmhouse in the city of Whiting in Kansas, with Ruth and the children expected to renovate and make the property habitable. When they didn't meet his standards, Ryan would beat them all. The family constantly had money troubles, and this was due to Ryan's inability to keep a job. He had no trouble getting jobs. He was charming and could talk his way into most positions, mainly in construction. But, as soon as he gained employment, there would always be a problem, mainly related to his bosses. They, according to him, would bully and harass him, ignoring the fact that he was lazy, work shy, and would often steal from the companies he worked for. No, it was everyone else's fault when he lost the jobs. Eventually, in his late 20s, Michael Ryan did obtain a job he stuck at until the early 1980s, with him working as a truck driver. He enjoyed the freedom this gave him, and he would crisscross the Midwest making deliveries. No oversight, no boss, and it was these trips away that would be the only respite for the family. Despite working long hours, the family continued to not have any money, which makes me question what Ryan was doing on the road. He was a man who liked to abuse others and was a sexual sadist. I cannot believe that he didn't use the solitary nature of his job to indulge his vices. I would suspect a lot of his money went on prostitutes. That's assuming he even paid them for their services, and did not just rape them. However, regardless, everything was someone else's fault. Michael Ryan was master and king in his own domain, a man who was never at fault, who should be allowed to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. If anyone defied him, they would be mercilessly abused. He was a monster, a narcissist, and almost inevitably a psychopath, who had a talent to charm and manipulate people, all in order to exploit them to get his own way, with him having no remorse for his actions. In the late 1970s, whilst living in Whiting, Kansas, Michael Ryan was introduced by his brother-in-law to the teachings of James Wickstrom, a horrific vile excuse for a man, a hate preacher who trawled the Midwest in both the 1970s and 1980s looking for disenfranchised and angry people to join his racist, homophobic and anti-Semitic cult. Ryan began to attend lectures given by Wickstrom, and it was this meeting of two evil minds which would start a chain reaction leading to the horrific crimes which occurred in the tiny village of Rulo in Nebraska just a few years later. James Wickstrom, who thankfully is no longer amongst the living, was a hate-filled piece of shit who between the 1970s and when he finally shuffled off this mortal coil in March 2018 went around the US delivering unhinged, violent, homophobic, anti-Semitic and racist sermons calling for, in particular, the extermination of the Jews. In an interview in 2004, he said that people, after beating Jews to death, should, quote, throw them in the wood chipper, and then, from the wood chipper, let the remains go into a big incendiary truck, which is right behind the wood chipper, and give them the Holocaust they rightly deserve. Also in 2003, at a white supremacist gathering, he stated, quote, I have a dream that in the days to come, there won't be anyone who isn't white that's gonna be in America. Wickstrom was a follower of a theory known as Christian identity, which is an interpretation of Christianity, which promotes the idea that white people are the true chosen people, and that all non-whites will be killed or enslaved, and that the white race would inherit a heavenly kingdom on earth, under the rule of Jesus Christ. This delusional pile of arse-dribble, belief, stems from an interpretation of passages in the Old Testament, which begins with Adam and Eve apparently having sex with a snake, and then it goes all on from there. Seriously, if you want to know more, look it up. It's completely off the deep end. Things like this make my blood boil and hurt my head. So let's start with the obvious. Jesus Christ wasn't, if he ever existed, white. He was born in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, not Jersey. Also, the Garden of Eden, if such a place ever existed, was likely in modern-day Iraq. So Adam and Eve too, newsflash, not white. Pretty much every main character in the Bible was not white. Oh, and here's the absolute kicker. Jesus Christ was a Jew. Shock, horror. So how you get from that to what old fucknut here is banging on about is beyond me. I can't blame religion entirely. Ultimately, things like this are because of what we as human beings are like. Or as French philosopher Blaise Pascal once said, quote, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. So basically, unless we all sit quietly on our own, we as a race always find ways to divide ourselves and find reasons to demonise other people. If it wasn't using religion to do this, we'd find something else. If you literally got rid of everything that divided us currently, and let's say gave half the people in the world blue hats and the other half red hats, we'd eventually start bickering about that, dividing ourselves, and potentially starting wars about who had the best hats. Sorry, that was a huge aside, but I do find it fascinating how individually people can be so kind and caring, but as a species, the human race is cruel and self-destructive. Anyway, if you think the mental gymnastics used to justify James Wickstrom's ramblings are ridiculous, trust me, you haven't heard anything yet. So Wickstrom was one of the founder members of the Posse Comitatus, a group which, as well as being racist and anti-Semitic, was also anti-government and anti-tax, with them citing the latter as being unconstitutional. So you're anti-government, but when it suits you, you cite the Constitution. Good old hypocrisy. In the 1970s and 80s, a combination of factors resulted in a period where farmers across the Corn Belt could no longer stay in business. This included a downturn in the economy, the foreign market drying up, and this resulted in many farmers taking on more debt to stay afloat, and then being unable to pay back these loans to the bank. This resulted in many hard-working Americans losing their farms. Wickstrom took full advantage of this and would travel throughout the Midwest, spewing his hatred, giving some of these people a focus for their desperation and someone to blame, whether this was the faceless government or the Jews, the blacks, the gays, etc. All Wickstrom needed was an in, a subject these people felt aggrieved about. He could then spread his poison to other aspects of their lives. So your farm has been taken, blame the Jews. Can't get another job? Clearly that's because the immigrants have taken them all. He then twisted this to saying, actually, you know what? You are the chosen people. So you go from being in a desperate state, in complete despair, and someone comes along and tells you, actually, you're a soldier of God, although he will refer to God as Yahweh, which is the name which God himself is apparently meant to have called himself in the book of Exodus, whilst communicating with Moses. It's easy to see why this is an intoxicating idea, and why you might be drawn into the web of someone who makes these sort of comments. Just to add a bit of gravitas, it doesn't hurt if you give yourself various titles, like calling yourself Doctor, as Wickstrom did, despite never earning that right. It just helps with the whole, I am better than you should do what I say angle. Add to this, the key element of this person claiming to be in direct contact with God, you have yourselves the building blocks of a religious cult. Specifically, James Wickstrom pretended to give his followers answers and comfort in times of trouble, as well as giving them a focus for their frustration and hate, and creating a them versus us situation by making them fear that the government and or specific types of people would, if it was not for his guidance, wisdom and protection, destroy them. This was all possible because he had the backing of God, so all of his commands had to be followed, without question. By making the outside world seem hostile, the member turns inward. They begin to see the cult leader as the only source of truth, their only salvation. These are, what I'll call, for want of a better term, the traits of the followers, people led to believe, often due to desperation, that they are now empowered, that the whole point of a cult is to strip them of their identity, essentially making them drones to be used and controlled. However, the leaders are different. They're often psychopathic, extremely narcissistic, sadistic, and motivated by power and control. Whether the leaders actually believe what they spout is, to some extent, inconsequential. The important thing is their followers do, and they're brainwashed enough that mention of the name of the Almighty will enable them to direct their followers to get whatever they want and do whatever they want without question, which, as we'll get into, can involve some of the most horrific acts of violence you could ever imagine. Michael Ryan began as a follower and would spend hours going through his own Bible with his wife Ruth, reinterpreting passages to fit his twisted worldview, which aligned with that of Wickstrom, that everyone else was to blame for all of his issues, and that, as a white man, he was superior to every other race. These beliefs no doubt compounded his already narcissistic view, which was shown by his abusive behaviour, especially towards his wife. However, Michael Ryan was a man driven by control. He wanted to exploit others, have them do whatever he commanded, and I've no doubt that at Wickstrom's hate-filled lectures, he looked around him and saw people fawning over him, worshipping him as some sort of god, and he wanted this. No doubt he began taking mental notes of how to manipulate people, refining his already pre-existing propensity to act in this way, with the hope that he too could become a leader, a person in a position of absolute power and control over people he could use and abuse at will. Soon, Michael Ryan began running his own Bible study groups in his home, injecting his poison into the minds of others, who were all followers of James Wickstrom. Ryan was a master manipulator, as well as being charismatic, and he developed a small following of his own. During these meetings, Ryan would say that any Bible verse which didn't conform to his deranged beliefs, quote, the Jews added. Evil recognises evil, and Ryan quickly came to the attention of Wickstrom, and had at least one private meeting with him. He saw Ryan's potential, began to groom him to be his representative in Kansas and Nebraska. Wickstrom taught Ryan something which is integral to what happened next, and is evidence of the truly unhinged nature of cults. Specifically, Wickstrom taught Ryan the quote, arm test, which involved one group member holding out their right arm. A second group member would then place one hand on the wrist of the first group member's extended arm and one hand on their right shoulder. The second member would then apply downward pressure to the arm and would ask a question of Yahweh. If the answer was yes, then the arm would drop. If it was a no, then the arm would stay extended. Here is a very short clip of Ruth and Dennis describing this test.
One person would hold out their right arm.
Put your arm out like that, and then the other person would ask a question.
And they pushed down on it. If your arm stayed up, then it was yes. If your arm fell, then it was no.
And honest, you had no control over it.
Absolute lunacy. So essentially this arm test could clearly be rigged to get the outcome you wanted. So you could have a group member who you know to have low physical strength with their arm out, and a strong member pushing down their arm in order to ensure the arm dropped, and so the answer was yes, and then vice versa to ensure the opposite outcome. However, Michael Ryan wanted to be a leader in his own right, not simply Wickstrom's second in command. He was running his Bible study groups, and himself was developing a small following of his own, and he began to put into motion forming his own cult, which would eventually result in him, along with around 25 others, including children, moving to an 80-acre farm just outside the tiny village of Rulo in Nebraska in 1984. Breaking here, I need to outline the final important elements of a cult. Firstly, it's common for cults to set up communities, or compounds, where the members can be more effectively cut off from the outside world, including their own families. In these environments, every element of their lives can be observed and manipulated. Again, there's an illusion of freedom and empowerment when the exact opposite is true. These places are essentially prisons. Escape is extremely unlikely, often impossible. These sites are behind closed doors and sometimes televised for the eyes of the whole world to see, places of abuse, violence, murder and death, where dissent is punished without mercy. With Jim Jones, he set up the People's Temple Agricultural Project, better known by the informal name, quote, Jonestown, a remote settlement in Guyana, where eventually 918 people, including 276 children, would die in a mass suicide/mass murder directed by Jones. With David Koresh, he set up a compound for his Branch Davidian cult in the Mount Carmel Center, a set of buildings around 20 miles outside of Waco in Texas, where in April 1993, 82 people, including 28 children, would die. Secondly is the stockpiling of firearms, often procured illegally either through theft of the weapons themselves, or more often, bought using the proceeds of crime committed by the followers, often thefts, burglaries, etc. The cult leader will often state that these are being procured in readiness for the impending holy war, or when the government attacks. However, the reality is that these weapons are used by trusted members of the cult to wield power over the followers in order to keep them in line, and, when the government comes calling, to arm these followers and send them out like cannon fodder, essentially creating a human shield so that dear leader can maintain their position. If they're going to lose this, and potentially their life, then they will demonstrate their power one last time by taking everyone else with them. The horror of religious cults cannot be understated, and the one established by Michael Ryan, whilst nowhere near the scale of those created by Jim Jones or David Koresh, was no less horrifying. At the farm in Rulo would be the scene of truly depraved and sickening crimes that are almost beyond belief. Whilst Michael Ryan and his followers moved to the farm in Rulo in 1984, this was simply the location where he solidified his hold over them. By the point of this move, the cult was already well established. In 1983, during the Bible study groups that Ryan ran, it was determined, through use of the arm test, that he possessed the spirit of the archangel Michael, who is depicted in the Bible as one of the lead angels, and the protector of man. Also, the arm test apparently proved that Ryan was in direct contact with Yahweh. With these quote-unquote facts determined, Ryan quickly began to exert his control over the group to get what he wanted. This included procuring women to sexually exploit. One of the women, known as Cheryl, was married, but Ryan told her that Yahweh had told him that she needed to leave her husband, who was, quote, on Satan's side. Using the arm test, it was apparently proven that Cheryl was not in fact married to her husband, and so, despite still being married to his long-suffering wife Ruth, Ryan took another wife, with the clearly unofficial ceremony being conducted by another cult member. Ryan would eventually marry at least 3 women in this manner, including Cheryl's mother. No doubt this was simply to have as many women as possible to have sex with. Sometime in 1983, Ryan began calling the cult members with, quote, orders from headquarters, with him telling them that Yahweh had told him that they needed to go out and steal. If there was any reluctance, then Ryan would tell them that their families would be at risk because they would be angering God. These crimes were intended to establish a, quote, base camp, with the money from the items they stole being used to buy food, generators, fuel, clothing, weapons and ammunition. These crimes occurred in Kansas, Missouri and Nebraska, and mainly involved the stealing of cattle, hogs and various large items of farm machinery and construction equipment. So remember, this is a time where farmers were struggling to put food on their table, and Ryan was directing the theft of the very things they depended on, whilst recruiting his members from this same group. However, Ryan told his followers the people they stole from were in league with Satan, and therefore they didn't own this property, and it should belong to the followers of Yahweh. These were not just petty and infrequent crimes. By the point of the downfall of the cult in 1985, they were found to be in possession of stolen goods valued in excess of $120,000. No doubt much of the money went straight into Michael Ryan's pocket, so he could fund a luxurious lifestyle, no doubt because God had told him this was his will. In order to outline what happened next, I need to go through some of the members of Ryan's cult. Around 15 adults and 10 children moved to the property in Rulo, but I want to focus on 4 adults, as well as 1 innocent child. Firstly is Aura Richard Stice, known as Rick, who was the owner of the farm in Rulo that the cult moved to. It was an 80-acre pig farm, and, like other farmers, he was struggling to manage financially. He had also lost his wife Sondra in 1983, and so was also grieving whilst trying to raise his 3 young children. Rick, in his desperation, was seeking comfort and answers, and sometime in 1983 he was introduced to Michael Ryan and began to attend his Bible study groups, with some of these appearing to also be held at the farm. One of Rick's children was Luke Brandon Stice. Born on the 10th of October 1979, he would be one of the murder victims of the cult and would not live past the age of 5 years old. James Allen Thimm, the second eventual murder victim of the cult, was born on the 10th of July 1959 in the city of Beatrice in Nebraska. Soon after his birth, his mother became ill and passed away a few years later, leading to him being raised by foster parents, although it does appear he had some contact with his biological father during his childhood. James and his foster parents were Mennonites, which is part of the Protestant faith, with their beliefs including, amongst others, charity to others, pacifism, foot washing, church discipline, and separation from the world. They live in similar conditions to those of the Amish faith, but I believe that Mennonites, as opposed to the Amish, have embraced some modern technologies. Regardless, the tenets of the faith that James was raised in are at odds with the hate spewed by Michael Ryan, and despite my best efforts, I've been unable to identify how James became involved with Ryan's cult and why he adopted his belief system. Losing a parent at a young age can have a devastating effect on a child. Possibly James was looking for peace and some answers, but was not finding this through his current faith, and so fell into the clutches of Michael Ryan. However, it seems that James was not a true believer and began to see the horror of the group and wished to leave. This is likely the reason that he would be horrifically tortured and murdered in 1985. James Haverkamp, known as Jimmy, was born around 1959 and raised a devout Catholic, but in his early 20s he was suffering financial hardship, so began attending the meetings of James Wickstrom, where he met Michael Ryan, with him then attending his Bible study groups. It appears that he was particularly susceptible to the influence of Ryan, and was the instigator of many of the thefts used to fund the establishment and running of the compound in Rulo. Jimmy was utterly devoted to the teachings of Ryan, and would do whatever he said. He would subsequently indoctrinate his family, with his mother, father, 3 sisters and his younger brother, all eventually moving to the compound. They were also eventually joined by Jimmy's cousin, Timothy Haverkamp, who was born around 1961 or 1962, and who had been indoctrinated to consider Michael Ryan as some sort of divine prophet. Lastly is John David Andreas, born in around 1955. He was a friend of James Thimm's, and it appears they met through the Bible groups run by Michael Ryan, and in fact, they accompanied each other when they moved to the Rulo farm. However, Andreas would be a central figure in the eventual torture and murder of his so-called friend. No doubt Michael Ryan saw the advantage of the Rulo farm. It was a place where he could wield ultimate control over his followers, and the isolated location would make escape extremely difficult, even impossible. He convinced Luke Stice to allow the followers to move to this location, stating the protection of the cult would mean he could keep hold of the farm, as he would have the support of his brothers and sisters. This would mean he could also raise his children. Between June and August 1984, the cult members moved onto the property, with Ryan taking his wife Ruth and his 3 children with him. As soon as the compound was established, Michael Ryan ramped up his tactics in order to completely dominate and isolate his followers, whilst directing them to mercilessly crush any challenge to his authority. As a starting point, Ryan sought to ensure that escape from the compound was almost impossible. The children were pulled out of school and educated on site. Decisions about who could leave the compound was determined using the arm test, which, as already stated, was something that Ryan could easily rig. The test was used to make all major decisions, but the followers were forbidden from using this without the direct authorization and oversight of Ryan. No doubt that he could choose who was involved in order to ensure the answer, apparent from God, that he wanted. Michael Ryan, as well as being the incarnation of the archangel Michael, gave himself other titles, including King and General, no doubt in order to ensure that his superiority over his followers was further reinforced. As I've stated repeatedly, cults are based on falsehoods, illusions of freedom, which are built on a foundation of lies, to strip the power away from those who have fallen into this dangerous web. At one point, Ryan did give his followers the option of leaving, but he said if they did, they would, quote, burn in hell. If the group member elected to stay, then they had to remain in the cult forever. If they tried to leave after that point, Ryan would personally hunt them down and murder them. Not much of a choice, is it? By the end of August 1984, the daily routine had been established within the compound. In the mornings, the women would consult with Yahweh, using the arm test, to determine what meals and chores they needed to complete. Ryan would then use the arm test to determine which group members needed to fast or do some penance for the day for infractions which had apparently angered God. He would also tell the group about visions he'd had, often reinforcing to them that they needed to prepare for the Battle of Armageddon, which would apparently occur in Rulo, and due to this, they needed an arsenal of weapons. Eventually, the group would acquire 75,000 rounds of ammunition and dozens of weapons, including pistols and a cache of automatic rifles. Whilst others were toiling away, Ryan would spend his days watching television, which others were banned from doing, having sex with the women in the compound, and smoking cannabis. In the evenings, he would direct group members to go out on stealing raids. He'd never go out on these himself, obviously, to ensure that if they were caught, he would not suffer any consequences. Michael Ryan assigned military ranks to the men in the cult, and, if they pleased him, they'd be promoted. If they did anything which he deemed unacceptable, God deemed unacceptable, they'd be demoted. Many of the men, through their devotion to Ryan, became generals. Top of this pile was Luke Stice, who attained the completely made-up rank of 6-star general. Michael Ryan never showed any interest in his children throughout their lives, but upon moving to the compound, he began to groom and manipulate his eldest son Dennis. By this point, he was 15 years old. This sick monster began to exploit his son's desperation for love and attention from his father, to mould him into the person who would take over the cult when he died. Dennis was assigned special rank and responsibilities within the compound, including overseeing the site when his father was away. Ryan would praise his son if he followed his orders, making him feel wanted for the first time in his life. Michael Ryan was clearly a misogynist. He saw women as mere objects to be used and abused. They were expected to keep the men fed and watered in the compound and look after the children. Ryan did not give them military ranks, but did coronate them with ridiculous titles, such as, quote, Queen of Israel. With him giving these titles, it would appear, solely to ensure that these women would continue to submit to his sexual demands. However, beginning in December 1984, just 5 months after the compound was established, members began falling out of favour with Ryan, including questioning his supremacy and teachings, and it was at this point that the horror at the farm in Rulo would begin, and the true evil of Michael Ryan would be exposed. The next two sections come with a warning, so I'm going to discuss extreme acts of violence, including acts of rape, bestiality and incest involving a child. Please, if this will offend you, click off the video now, or skip forward to the section marked Downfall. Despite Luke Stice having opened up his home to the cult, he quickly began to fall out of favour with Michael Ryan. In December 1984, he lost his farm, and money that the cult had acquired had to be used to purchase the property. After this point, Michael Ryan began to claim that Rick had raped one of the female cult members, but was also having, quote, bad thoughts. He was also demoted in rank and moved into a trailer as punishment. In order to further punish Rick, Ryan began to abuse his son Luke, who was just 5 years old. Ryan would stub out cigarettes on Luke's body and draw the number 666 on his forehead, while saying that he was a child of Satan. In order to perform penance, Rick was ordered to beat Luke, and this he did whilst Ryan stood and watched. In January and February 1985, Luke himself and James Thimm apparently made a cardinal sin in Michael Ryan's eyes. At a Bible study group, both of them questioned whether Yahweh actually existed, and by virtue of this, whether Ryan was actually a prophet. As punishment, James was chained to a porch. Due to the actions of his son, Luke Stice was further demoted to the rank of, quote, slave, and Luke was called a, quote, dog, mongrel, gook, or dog shit. At one point, Luke Stice fled the farm, but soon returned due to fearing, quote, eternal damnation. As an initial punishment, he, like James Thimm, was chained up like an animal, but this is nothing compared to what happened next. So, in Michael Ryan's eyes, he had three challenges to his authority who needed to be dealt with: Luke Stice, Luke Stice, and James Thimm. He therefore devised sickening acts of abuse to punish them for their dissent, but also to reinforce to all the other members the consequences of questioning his ultimate control over them. Michael Ryan threatened to amputate Rick's penis and to skin and burn his son Luke alive. In March 1985, James Thimm was instructed to have anal sex with Luke Stice and was specifically told, quote, make him hurt. Rick was also for fuck's sake, really. Rick was also forced to perform oral sex on Luke, who, as a reminder, was just 5 years old, and he was forced to do the same in return. These acts all occurred whilst the male members of the group stood on and watched, with Ryan overseeing and directing the abuse, stating that it was Yahweh's will that this was happening. In between these group punishments, the three would be abused individually, and on around March the 25th, 1985, whilst Ryan was beating Luke, he hit him with so much force that his head was slammed into the side of a cabinet. He was knocked unconscious and was simply left on the floor. In the morning, he was found to have died due to the severity of the head trauma he suffered, which caused significant internal bleeding. His neck had also been broken. James Thimm and Luke Stice were then forced to dig a grave on the property, and Luke's body was then dumped like rubbish into the hole. After Luke's death, the abuse of Luke Stice and James Thimm continued. Both men were regularly chained up and beaten by other group members. Rick was also forced to have sex with a goat on 3 separate occasions. On April the 4th, 1985, Luke Stice went into town to cash his social security check with one other group member. He was able to slip away and escape, and went into hiding. It should be noted that Luke Stice left 2 of his children back at the compound. It doesn't appear from my research that he made any effort to contact the authorities to try to get them out of an environment that was clearly incredibly dangerous. With him gone, this left James Thimm all on his own. Michael Ryan was no doubt enraged. Despite his acts of punishment, a follower had escaped. He needed to escalate the severity of his punishment to demonstrate his ultimate control. As a result of this, James Thimm would suffer a horrifying death. The end for James Thimm started on April the 27th, 1985, when Michael Ryan declared to the group that James had poisoned a turkey that they were about to eat. James was beaten and taken to a barn, where he was chained up for the night. On April the 28th, Ryan told the men in the group that Yahweh had told him that James needed to be tortured, and so he, Jimmy and Timothy Haverkamp, Dennis Ryan, and John Andreas went into the barn to carry out God's will. James was told to undress and bend over a crate. Ryan informed him that Yahweh had told him that he needed to be, quote, probed. Michael Ryan then inserted a shovel handle about 5 or 6 inches into James Thimm's rectum for around 30 seconds. When James began fidgeting, his hands were tied with baling wire. Michael Ryan then informed the others that Yahweh had told him the shovel handle needed to be inserted between 8 to 10 inches into James's rectum. This measurement was marked on the handle. Ryan then inserted the handle and told James whilst he was doing this, quote, "I ought to shove this thing up to your heart." A pathologist would later determine that the handle was actually forced approximately 2 to 3 feet into James's rectum, with such force that it caused damage to his liver. Ryan then directed each of the others to probe Ryan in this way, with the shovel handle, which they all did. Due to his screams, James's mouth was taped. It was decided the shovel handle was not punishment enough, and so a pickaxe handle was then used, and James was again anally raped with this object by all of the men. By this point, his anal wall had ruptured, and he would have been in horrific pain. The perpetrators then broke for lunch, with Michael Ryan telling the men and his teenage son that Yahweh had told him that James had not been punished enough. They then returned to the barn where James was tied, with his hands above his head, and he was whipped 15 times by each man. Heartbreakingly, and showing the level of indoctrination of this group, during the torture, James Thimm never once denounced Michael Ryan. Instead, he screamed for God to forgive him and to save him. In response, Ryan said, quote, "Yahweh's given up on you. You don't have any hope anymore." After the whipping, James was untied, given a sleeping bag, and chained up. This would be his final night on earth. At breakfast the next morning, April the 29th, 1985, Michael Ryan again told the men involved that Yahweh was still displeased with James and that he needed to be punished more. The men returned to the barn and again began administering lashes from a leather whip. After 75 lashes to his back, James was secured to the floor on his back and whipped to the front of his body. James's left hand was then bound, palm up, on a block of wood, and Michael Ryan then used a revolver to shoot the tip off one of his fingers. Michael Ryan then directed the others to do the same, which they did. All of the fingertips and the thumb were shot off James's left hand. At lunch, Michael Ryan declared that Yahweh had told him that James Thimm needed to die that afternoon. The men returned to the barn one final time. Ryan again led the abuse. He kicked one of James's arms, breaking it. He then put on a pair of yellow kitchen gloves and, using a razor blade, made incisions on James's leg before then pulling these strips off with a pair of pliers, essentially skinning him. Ryan then directed his son Dennis to break James's other leg. He did this by taking a piece of 2x4 and hitting him repeatedly until the bone in James's leg snapped. All the men then took turns hitting James with pieces of wood, shattering and splintering his bones. James was drifting in and out of consciousness, and, with glee, Michael Ryan bent down and asked him whether he thought that Yahweh meant business. Ryan then said to the others, quote, "I'll cave his chest in. That's sure to kill him." He then proceeded to stamp on James's chest with all of his might, whilst wearing cowboy boots. Sometime during this final assault, James Thimm died. For good measure, Michael Ryan directed Timothy Haverkamp to fire a bullet into James's head, which he did. He then directed the other men to dig a grave, which, according to Yahweh, needed to be, quote, 6 foot long by 3 foot wide and 6 foot deep. James's naked and mutilated body was then dumped in the hole and covered with dirt. On June the 25th, 1985, John Andreas and Jimmy Haverkamp had gone out on one of their stealing raids and were transporting a sprayer rig back to the compound in Rulo when they were stopped and arrested by the police. Whilst in jail, both men notified the police that they had a tale of horror to tell, and they gave full details about the horror at the farm in Rulo, including the murders of Luke Stice and James Thimm. Why they decided to confess is not clear. Because of the secretive nature of the cult, the police likely didn't have any idea that these crimes had occurred. Potentially both men had some level of remorse for what they'd done. Regardless of the reason for their confession, On August 17, 1985, a huge task force descended on the property. This comprised of FBI agents, agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, Nebraska State Patrol officers, and officers from the Richard County Sheriff's Department. In addition, they were accompanied by both Jimmy Haverkamp and John Andreas, who over the next 2 days directed the authorities around the 80-acre property, showing them where both Luke and James had been murdered and buried so their bodies could be recovered. This short clip shows a video shot at the scene, which shows the building and room where James Thimm was murdered, with Jimmy Haverkamp giving a brief explanation for what happened to James and why.
What happened when you first, or when they brought him back here into this room?
Came up, we were also whipped him 15 times with the whip.
Did he say for what reason you were supposed to do this?
Because he had angered God.
Michael Ryan, Timothy Haverkamp and Dennis Ryan were subsequently arrested and joined John Andreas and Jimmy Haverkamp in prison, whilst the full horror of the Rulo cult was investigated. Michael Ryan was charged with the first-degree murders of both Luke Stice and James Thimm, whilst the other 4 defendants were charged with the first-degree murder only of James. They were all remanded into prison to await their day in court. Legal proceedings against all the men began in early 1986. At court, Timothy Haverkamp pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of James Thimm, i.e. there was an intention to kill, but it was not premeditated, with him telling the court that he believed that God had directed James's death, based on what he'd been told by Michael Ryan. John Andreas and Jimmy Haverkamp also pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder of James. Dennis Ryan pleaded not guilty and went to trial, but was found guilty of the second-degree murder of James Thimm. John Andreas and both of the Haverkamps appeared as witnesses for the state at Michael Ryan's trial for the first-degree premeditated murder of James Thimm. He was remorseless to the last. He attempted to throw everyone else, including his 16-year-old son, under the bus in order to save his own skin. At the trial, the full horror of the injuries suffered by James Thimm was entered into evidence. 2 autopsies had been conducted on his body, and they showed a horrifying catalogue of abuse. James's anus was dilated due to him having been repeatedly anally raped with various objects. His rectal wall was found to have been perforated, and damage being caused to his internal organs due to these objects being forced several feet into his body. James's left hand was missing the thumb and the fingertips from all of his fingers due to being shot off. The left arm was broken, the bones in both legs were shattered, and James had multiple rib fractures. He had multiple bruises from repeated beatings, and his body was covered in marks from being whipped approximately 150 to 200 times. A large section of skin from one of his legs had been cut and then forcibly pulled away from the muscle beneath. James was found with both his wrists and ankles bound with wire. A bullet wound was found in James's skull, but this was found to have occurred after he passed away. There were also suspicions that James's penis had been cut off, but it was not clear whether it being found disconnected from his body was as a result of a deliberate act or as a result of decomposition. James Thimm suffered 3 days of unimaginable torture. He must have died in absolute agony. Michael Ryan was found guilty of the first-degree murder of James Thimm and subsequently entered a no-contest plea to the second-degree murder of Luke Stice, i.e. he was acknowledging that the state had enough evidence to convict him of his crime without admitting his guilt. In late 1986, all of them were sentenced. Timothy Haverkamp was sentenced to between 10 years to life in prison for his role in the murder of James. He served 23 years in prison before being paroled in 2009. In 2014, due to his progress in the community, he was released from state supervision, which should have continued for the rest of his life. Jimmy Haverkamp was sentenced to between 1 and 26 years in prison for his role. He was paroled in 1998 after serving 13 years. John Andreas was also sentenced to between 1 and 26 years in prison. He too served 13 years in prison before being paroled. Dennis Ryan was sentenced to life imprisonment for his participation in the murder of James Thimm. In 1997 his conviction was overturned and he was instead found guilty of manslaughter, i.e. he intended to cause serious injury but not to kill. He was released in 1997 after having served 11 years. Michael Ryan was deemed to be the instigator and the driving force behind the murder of James Thimm, which was a crime of, quote, exceptional depravity due to the unnecessary suffering caused through days of torture before his ultimate death. For this reason, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection and was sent to death row to await his date with the executioner. For the second-degree murder of Luke Stice, Ryan was given a concurrent life sentence. It appears that all of those involved, except Michael Ryan, showed some level of remorse for their actions after their incarceration, and by and large, they accepted their punishments. It appears that when they were removed from the influence of Michael Ryan, the enormity of their crimes dawned on them, and the lies they built their lives on crumbled from beneath them. I found a very short clip of Dennis Ryan talking about his crimes. This clip is undated, but appears to be within the last 10 years. It's only short, but I want you to see it.
I can't take it back. I can't ever change it. I just, I gotta... you gotta live with it every day. If I would have had a different dad, maybe things would have been different. He went off the deep end. And he took me with him.
I do believe there's genuine remorse in this man's demeanour and voice. I'll speak more about Dennis Ryan in a bit, but it's clear that his life has been destroyed by the influence of his father. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether statements of remorse, after being involved in crimes as horrific as these, carry much weight, even taking into account the psychological manipulation that they were subjected to as part of the Rulo farm cult. However, Michael Ryan was unapologetic until the end. After his conviction, he declared that he was still in contact with God and was going to spend his time rewriting the Bible to reflect his twisted doctrine. In between doing this, he filed several voluminous appeals trying to get his conviction and sentence overturned. These appeals cited ridiculous claims, which were obviously lies, including claiming that jurors were falling asleep during the trial or reading newspapers openly in court whilst evidence was being presented. Michael Ryan also cited judicial misconduct against anyone and everyone involved in his case and claimed that his constitutional rights had been violated. Again, isn't it funny how people like this, who believe themselves above the law and care nothing for the rights of others, suddenly wheel out the Constitution when it suits them? All of his appeals were rejected. However, Michael Ryan would never be executed. In around 2012, he was diagnosed with salivary gland cancer, and by early 2015, this was terminal. When he heard the news of his father's impending death, Dennis stated, quote, "So he's finally going to die. Best for everyone. Good riddance. Flush him down the toilet for all I care." Michael Wayne Ryan died of cancer on May the 24th, 2015, removing one less evil from the world. His body was cremated, but I have no information about where his ashes were scattered. Hopefully, they were flushed down the toilet. There are so many layers to unpack in this case. As a headline, it's apparent that Michael Wayne Ryan was an extremely dangerous individual, a man whose life was driven by the need to dominate and control others in order to abuse and exploit them for his own sick gratification. He had no remorse, empathy or concern for anyone else but himself. Going deeper, I think that Ryan saw the world very differently to many of us. He saw people in terms of a hierarchy, depending on what trait he used to define them. So, with regards to race, he considered those who were white to be superior to people from any other race. With regards to gender, women were inferior to men. In terms of religion, Christianity, or at least its distorted view of this religion, was superior to any other belief system, with Judaism being right at the bottom. However, due to his narcissism, in each of these hierarchies he sat at the top. So for example, he was white, so therefore superior to other races generally, but amongst his Caucasian compatriots, they were inferior to him. Due to his twisted feelings of superiority, Ryan had developed a sense of entitlement, whereby he believed he should be allowed to act in any manner he wanted and exploit anyone he felt he could gain something from. The rules didn't apply to him, and anyone who dared question him needed to be punished and shown how superior he was. Due to him having clear traits of psychopathy, he was able to do this without remorse, without guilt. I think he was a man who wanted to control people, and his joining the military was based on this. He was not interested in serving his country, I think all he wanted to do was become an officer and have the power to order people around. I think, given his history, he wouldn't have lasted long in the military. He probably would have dropped out when he realised he actually had to work for this. So in the absence of this, he was a domineering monster who mercilessly abused his wife and children. They were to be controlled and forced to follow his rules, whilst he did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. He repeatedly raped his wife, and I think this is a horrific but important aspect of this case for what happens later. It's described that she would cry and scream during these incidents. I think this is an indicator of his sexual sadism, with Ryan getting off on seeing the pain that he caused his wife through this violation. As with other narcissists, nothing was ever his fault, and I have little doubt that before he'd even met James Wickstrom, Michael Ryan was already an ardent racist and antisemite. He needed someone to blame for everything that was wrong in his life, and had likely selected specific types of people whose fault it was that he was a lazy, dishonest waster. His interaction with Wickstrom, I believe, turned a terrible situation into a nightmare by adding various elements which Ryan would use to full effect to commit his crimes. Firstly, I think that seeing the power that Wickstrom had over his congregation showed what a narcissist could really achieve: complete dominance over every aspect of people's lives, directing how they thought, how they acted, with them worshipping him like a god. It gave Ryan something to aspire to, a challenge. Secondly, no doubt he used these sermons as teaching exercises, a way to hone his skills to exploit and manipulate others into doing whatever he wanted, with him being taught the arm test, something that was easy to rig in order to get the outcome he desired. Thirdly, it brought him into contact with a huge number of potential victims, vulnerable and desperate people who just wanted answers, prime targets who he knew he could easily exploit. It's important here to pose the question of whether Michael Ryan believed the nonsense that he later told his cult members. I think the answer is complicated. It's both yes and no. Do I believe that Ryan actually believed he heard the voice of God, like someone whispering in his ear? No, I do not. I think this is what he told the group to make his claims seem more credible. There's no indicator from the information I've read that he was ever diagnosed with any delusional disorder. However, it does appear that Ryan did believe the Christian identity theology, that white people were essentially the master race and all other races would be violently eradicated, and that this was gleaned from a reinterpretation of the Bible. This fed into Ryan's already present white supremacist beliefs. He's reported to have spent a significant amount of time rewriting Bible verses to fit his twisted worldview, and whilst we'll never know what he wrote, I've no doubt that he created a narrative whereby he projected his own sickness onto these words and convinced himself that God wanted his followers to torture and murder others. So whilst he may not have had God whispering in his ear, Ryan likely believed that his love of violence, death and destruction was something that the Almighty would approve of, so he was free to say, yeah, Yahweh wants that, or Yahweh wants this, to get what he himself wanted to achieve, to wield ultimate control over other human beings. I mentioned the issue of sexual sadism earlier, as I think it's an important part of Michael Ryan's offending. Specifically, it's clear that his abuse of Rick Stice, Luke Stice, and James Thimm was heavily sexually motivated, including forcing incest between a man and his son, directing acts of bestiality, forcing men to rape each other, and anally raping a man with objects. These acts, which were watched by other group members, were clearly a way to demonstrate to the group the consequences of defying him, but I think the nature of these punishments was not arbitrary, and tells us a lot about Michael Ryan. Specifically, I believe that Ryan gained a great deal of sexual gratification from watching these acts, getting aroused from the degradation, humiliation, and pain his victims were forced to endure. The fact these acts occurred on males suggests to me that Ryan potentially had a paedophilic interest in little boys, but also had some level of sexual attraction to adult men. In amongst all of the horrors of this case, there's one aspect that for some reason bothers me more than anything, and that is Michael Ryan's manipulation and exploitation of his own son. I think this hits a sore spot for me, as children are the greatest gift that a person can ever have. It's also the greatest responsibility in life, as the parents essentially have complete control over that child, who looks to them for everything. A parent could very easily abuse that trust, and whilst 99% of parents only want the best for their children, and they would die rather than watch them come to harm, there are the 1% who revel in this power and use it to their own ends. This includes those monsters who, for example, sexually abuse their own children, essentially destroying their lives or those who kill them, robbing them of any future at all. Michael Ryan fits into this category. He spent years abusing Dennis and was likely fully aware that all he wanted was his love and attention. He exploited this to such a disturbing degree that he convinced his 15-year-old son that the way to please him was to commit acts of horrific violence, something he has to live with for the rest of his life. And then, when he was caught, he tried to throw this same child under the bus, betraying him utterly. I've no doubt there will be aspects of this case which resonate with people on different levels for different reasons, but the callousness shown towards his son and the deliberate destruction of his life in order to get what he wanted is to me absolutely abhorrent. I'm not going to mince my words here. I'm very glad that both Michael Ryan and James Wickstrom are dead. There's already enough division in society, and these fear-mongering pieces of shit added nothing positive to this world. The scary thing is that when pieces of shit like this die, there always seems to be another 5 who spring up to take their place, so the cycle of hatred just goes on and on. So, what's your thoughts on this case? I, and I'm sure many other people, would be really interested in comments from those who may have had personal experience being in a cult or having family members in one. Obviously only comment with personal stories if you feel comfortable to do so. If you like the content, please consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, which is £2.99 a month or around $4. You get early access to videos and an icon next to your name, which changes from bronze to silver to gold, depending on how long you're a member. Also, please consider sending a super thanks, which is a one-off payment to support the channel. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.